we're never gonna survive unless we get a little crazy.
And this album is from 1990 and 1991, released in the May, and it's this guy, Seal, British artist. This is Crazy, the CD single, which was released about 2 years later, I think, 1990. I also got this as well, called The Beginning as well. I've got a lot of this, but this is my original copy of Seal's CD, and I didn't really have CDs very often, but this is one of my first. So, Seal, the first debut album, and a lot of people don't mention about Seal. They always mention about Kiss from a Rose, which is from the second album, the Batman soundtrack. I get it, but Seal, when he first came out, was very influential to people who was doing music. I was born in 1981. By 1990, getting into music, playing keyboards, singing, Seal was very influential. And while it was released in 1991, the album, Seal had already released singles already in 1990. In fact, Killer got re-released in 1991, and I'd heard the original by Adamski, who was a rave producer, and he had Seal featuring on it. Now, Seal had some great songs on this album, and he wrote a lot of them with a guy called Guysigworth, and Guy Sigworth has wrote with Imogen Heap and a load of other. I think he's also written with Bjork as well. But there is, for example, there was 2 versions of the album as well, so it was very confusing. Because 2 versions of the album, there was minor and major differences in 3 songs. The shorter version of Wild is more rock based and heavier than the original. Shorter version of Violet, and the only way to tell is the CD matrix. So I think this is the original version. The Killer one I've got is the UK #1 single, which was done by Adamski. It was different. So I think this one is the original one, not the remix CD. So it's slightly different. When we're talking about Seal as an artist is very unique. He's got a very specific voice, kind of can sound ballads, but also can sing rock, can sing R&B. His music is quite quirky as well, so it wasn't obvious, and in the 90s it was quite revolutionary at that time. When I listened to Seal, there was a lot of this thing with his album. It's very much a personal thing which we listen to and love, and with Seal, Crazy, which is a great song, kind of the idea of the mill of life and how people struggle to live and survive, which I think was very much coming into the 90s after the 80s, because there were so much issues there. With Killer, very much sort of like a dance track with an R&B vocal, kind of influenced by house and everything else, and it was commercial. I mean, it was a #1 song, and it was #1 for a reason, because it was pretty unique at the time. You've got to imagine at the same time Killer was released, there'd been in 1990 there'd been things like the pop world was doing, like you had Stock Your Naked in Waterman in the UK, and then you had things like MC Hammer from America, which was terrible. And so there was there was dance songs, but they weren't pop songs. They were very of their time. The one thing with Seal is his music was, if you listen to this album now, listen to stuff, it doesn't sound like the 90s. It's just great songs, great production, really well arranged. The main producer of this was Trevor Horn, who'd done The Buggles and done Frankie Goes to Hollywood and all this stuff, and it was very much an interesting album, great musicianship. In fact, a lot of the musicians ended up working for, I think the drummer, Gotter, he ended up working with Simply Red eventually. There were some really good musicians. The programming is excellent, but again, it does feel, it feels alive. It doesn't feel just like again, I was talking about this with program music before. Sometimes program music can feel a bit robotic, and the way Seal done it was because Seal may have had, like with Killer, he had the electronic sounds and the robotic sounds, but then his voice was it wasn't very sample based. There's a lot of stuff was sample based, like Ride on Time stuff. He had like that sample vocals all processed, and he wasn't. It was like it felt real. And I think that was very interesting going to the 90s, because this is where music was starting to really get interesting, because the new era. And I feel that Seal was someone who, for British music, R&B, soul, and it was coming from Britain. And it was interesting because we'd always hear stuff from America, the New Jack Swing and all this stuff. But what you got to think of is that with this, he was coming up with something quite unique, and there was nobody in America like it. Nobody was doing that stuff in America, what Seal was doing. And what Seal was doing, I don't think anybody in any other country was doing it. He was very unique at that time. Seal, obviously, with 3 years later, he did the second album, and that's got some great ballads. And I think I think there was probably that first album, Nerves, that he worked years to get through these tracks. And I think with Seal, there was sort of like Terence Trent D'Arby had done well with the first album, then he kind of didn't really deliver on the other stuff. So I think Seal was kind of he was at the right time, the right audience, and I think what he did, his music with his vocals was so emotional, and then he had the dance music at that time. And I mean, I was too young. I couldn't go down to clubs in London or so forth. I was too young, but I could hear how he, and I don't know if that was by great production ideas or him himself, but I think what he'd done, he'd been listening to music and thought, that's great, I love these ideas, but I want to put my sound, my influence of soul and thing. And if you listen to Seal's later catalogues, he does soul music or ballads singing and so forth. And I think he gets that right. And I think this is why this album is so influential to people, and especially my generation. Like, I'm 40 now, and I think if I did music now properly, I still would be influenced by Seal, because I think he was very much someone. When I think of production, I'm always thinking of the idea when I was in the 90s, especially when I was growing up, even at university, I was thinking, like, how can I have that organic, beautiful, melodic, emotional sound, but have electronic production and make it sound great? And I think Seal did that really well. So this is an album, maybe kind of a surprise to people, but for me, musically, I think Seal was a revolutionary at the time, and I do feel that he was someone who I think really took the bull by the horns and did something very creative. And do I think Seal's later music is good? I think it is. I just think it's just the timing. I mean, there's I think the album Beings. I mean, every Seal album he does, it's very well written, and I just feel that maybe the impact of the first album was so good, and he hit it at the right time. And maybe over time people have just, music's changed or whatever. But Seal as an artist, people should never underestimate, because he did help a lot of British acts get known in the States because of his album and because of his influence, and also people taking risks. I mean, Seal, when Seal first came out, he was risky. I mean, got, all his hair's in weird braids, he dressed in like this kind of leather stuff. He looked like someone from the future. He looked like some bloody person who was going to be in, if you watch Demolition Man, you see like Wesley Snipes. That's how Seal used to dress when he first came out. And you imagine you see that on Top of the Pops, and you'd see all these like people with nice suits and all these sort of like, really polished acts, and then Seal's coming out looking like someone who's just come out, out of like the war zone from Terminator 2 in the future or something. It comes into, sings this song, and I don't know, I just feel like I really respect Seal, and I just think that album is excellent, and I think that would be great for you to listen to, is really listen to this album and just get some ideas and see how creative how creative Seal was, and the production was, and at a moment in time it was really good, because it was that going into that influence. And I think also, when we go into rave music in the 90s, we go into like the Prodigy and stuff like that. I mean, they transformed it a different way. But I think Seal, to keep in that sensibility, which was also radio friendly, I think he was a genius, and I think he should get more props in the music industry than he does.
But we're never gonna survive unless we get a little